The smoke reached me before the alarm did. I was in the east corridor, 3 floors above the reactor level, carrying a translation tablet and a cold cup of coffee I had been meaning to drink for the past hour, when the air changed. Not dramatically. Just a shift, the way the back of your throat knows something is wrong before your brain catches up. A dryness. A warmth that did not belong in a palace built to stay cool. I stopped walking. I tilted my head, and then the lights went red. I had been at the Velhari Imperial Court for 2 years, long enough to know that a red light was not a drill. The corridor filled instantly, not with people running, but with people standing still. That was the thing about the Velhari that took me the longest to understand. They did not panic outwardly, they froze. It was not weakness. It was not cowardice. It was biology as old as their species, a locked response that had kept their ancestors alive, on a world where fire meant a predator was burning the grass to flush them into the open. When the light hit amber and the heat rolled through the ventilation, every Velhari in that corridor simply stopped. I did not stop. I was moving before I fully understood why. I told myself later that it was training, that somewhere in my head the old wiring kicked in, that humans are pursuit predators who cooked their food and sat around campfires and treated flame as a companion rather than a death sentence. All of that is probably true, but if I am being honest, the reason I moved was simpler. I knew which room was at the end of the East Wing. I had sat in that room 3 nights a week for the past 7 months, playing chess on a board with pieces carved from pale stone, drinking contraband earth coffee that Saravi had smuggled in through the diplomatic supply line because she thought it smelled like a forest after rain. She was in there, so I moved. The corridor behind me was a gallery of statues. Commander Orith, who had 20 years of service and a chest full of citations, stood with one arm half raised, his eyes moving, but his body locked, watching me pass. A pair of junior courtiers were frozen mid-step. A palace medic had her kit open and her hands unable to reach inside it. None of them were choosing this. I understood that. I just could not afford to feel sympathy for it right now. The heat got worse fast. The East Wing had its own ventilation loop, and whatever was burning in the reactor subfloor had been feeding up through the ducts long enough that the air in the corridor was already the kind of hot that makes your eyes water. I pulled my jacket sleeve over my mouth, which did nothing useful but made me feel like I was doing something, and I moved faster. I passed 2 sealed doors. The automatic lockdown had engaged, which meant the fire suppression system had failed first, which meant this was a cascading failure, not a contained incident. My tablet was useless. The network in the East Wing was offline. I was navigating by memory. Saravi's private reading room was the 4th door on the left after the archway with the blue stone columns. I had walked this corridor so many times, I could have done it with my eyes closed. I did it now with my eyes burning and my lungs starting to object, and I counted the doors. 1, 2, 3, the archway. 4. The door was sealed. Not just locked, but physically jammed. The frame warped from the heat differential between the corridor and the room beyond. Through the small reinforced panel at eye level, I could see smoke, and through the smoke I could see her. Saravi was standing in the center of the room, with her arms slightly out from her sides, and her face completely blank, frozen. The fire had not reached the room itself yet, but the smoke had, and she could not move. Her eyes were tracking. She could see me through the panel. She was aware of everything happening to her, and completely unable to respond to any of it, and the look on her face was something I had never seen from her before. She was not angry, she was not commanding, she was terrified, in the way that only very controlled people can be terrified, when the control finally breaks, and there is nothing underneath it but fear. I hit the door panel, nothing. I tried the manual override slot, and found it already sheared off, probably from the frame warping. I stepped back, and looked at the door, the way a person looks at a problem they are about to solve with their shoulder. Which is to say, I looked at it for about 2 seconds before I accepted that my shoulder was not going to win this one. The panel was reinforced, but it was set into a frame that was now compromised. I found a fire extinguisher mounted to the corridor wall, and I used it the way it was not designed to be used. 3 hits to the upper right corner of the panel, where the warp was worst. The 4th hit cracked the seal. The 5th pushed the panel inward enough that I could grab the edge and pull, and the door came open with a sound like something that had been holding on for a long time finally letting go. The smoke billowed out and hit me like a wall. I went in anyway. She was heavier than she looked. Velhari build dense, their bones mineralizing differently from ours. And Saravi, despite being on the slender side for her species, was solid in a way that made me immediately regret not spending more time in the palace gym. I got my arms around her from behind and started walking backward toward the door, and she could not help me at all. Her body was limp with the freeze, but her weight was entirely present, and I was moving both of us on my own, across a floor that was getting hotter through my boots with every step. I made it to the door. I made it through the door. The corridor was still and bright with red light and full of frozen Velhari, and I kept moving, because stopping in a hot corridor with a person who could not breathe properly was not an option. I moved toward the main junction, toward the section of the palace that was still sealed and ventilated and not on fire, and I talked the entire time. Not to anyone, just out loud. I told Saravi she was going to be fine. I told her the smoke was clearing. I told her about the time I had gotten lost in a burning forest preserve outside my hometown when I was 12, and come out the other side absolutely fine and only mildly on fire, which was not entirely true, but was the kind of story that felt appropriate for the moment. I do not know if she could hear me. I kept talking anyway. The beam came from the left, out of the secondary maintenance access, and it was not a small beam. It was a ceiling support strut, and it came down fast, and I made a choice in approximately no time at all. I went right instead of stopping, which meant the beam clipped my left arm instead of both of us, and I did not let go of Saravi, and we kept moving. My arm did not feel like much of anything in the moment. Adrenaline is an excellent anesthetic and an even better liar. I learned later that I had a second-degree burn running from my elbow to my wrist. In the moment, I registered it as warmth and inconvenience and moved on. The junction door was unlocked. We came through it into a section of corridor that was cool and bright and populated with more frozen Velhari, and I got Saravi to the floor as gently as I could, and then sat down against the wall, because my legs had apparently been waiting for permission to stop, and they were now taking it. The freeze broke gradually. That is how it works. As the stimulus recedes, the lock releases, and it moves from the extremities inward, so you get people's fingers twitching first, and then their arms, and then finally the chest opens up, and the first breath comes in ragged and full of feeling. I watched it happen in the corridor. I watched Commander Orith's arm finally complete the motion it had started before the alarm, reaching forward into empty air. And then he was looking at his own hand like it belonged to someone else. Saravi came back to herself slowly. First her fingers, curling against the floor. Then her head turned, and her eyes found me, and she pulled a breath in that sounded like it hurt, and she looked at the burn on my arm. She said my name. Just my name, nothing else. But she said it in a way I had never heard her say it before, like it was something fragile and important, and I decided that was enough. Queen Vaelithra was at the junction. I did not see her come in. She was simply there, the way powerful people are sometimes simply there, as if they materialize rather than arrive. She was in her formal state dress, which meant she had been somewhere official when the alarm went, and she was looking at her daughter on the floor, and at the burn on my arm, and at the state of me in general. I had seen the queen from a distance many times, and close up a handful of times during official functions. She was not a warm figure. She was not designed to be. She ruled 42 star systems through a combination of genuine intelligence, perfect political instinct, and an authority so complete it had become atmospheric, something you breathed in when you entered a room she occupied. She had never looked at me directly. I was a liaison from a minor species on the edge of the charted territories, moderately useful, largely decorative. She looked at me directly now. And then, without a word, without any preparation or ceremony, Queen Vaelithra of the Velhari Empire went to her knees. Not gracefully, not as a performance. It was the motion of a person whose legs have simply made a decision without consulting the rest of them, the way a person kneels when they are very tired, or when something has gone out of them that was holding them up. She knelt on the corridor floor, in her formal dress, with her people standing frozen and thawing all around her, and she looked at me across the space between us, and she did not speak. I did not know what to say. I am usually reasonable with words. It is my job, technically, but there is no training that prepares you for an empress on her knees in a smoke-damaged corridor, looking at you like you have done something she has no category for. She was not thanking me. It was not gratitude, or not only gratitude. It was something older. It was the face of a person who has just learned, in the worst possible way, that there is a kind of strength she does not have and cannot acquire, and the only thing she can do in the presence of it is acknowledge it. She had stood in that corridor with the fire behind the east wing door, and she had been unable to move, and she had watched me walk past her into the smoke, and she had understood something, in that moment, that could not be unfiled. She knelt until Saravi put a hand on the floor and started pushing herself upright, and then the queen stood in one fluid motion, as if the kneel had never happened, and she walked to her daughter, and she put both hands on Saravi's face, and she said something in High Velhari that I did not have the translation for, something that was clearly private, and clearly not intended for my ears, and I looked at the ceiling and gave them a moment. Orith was fully unfrozen now. He crossed to me and crouched down and looked at my arm and said, in the flat professional tone of a man who is trying very hard not to feel things, that medical staff would be with me shortly. I said that would be great. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, quietly, and in the blunt way of someone who is unaccustomed to saying things they are not sure how to say, that he had wanted to move, that he had tried. I told him I knew that. He nodded. He did not look better about it, but he nodded, and he stood up, and he went to do the things a commander does after a fire, and I stayed where I was against the wall. The medics came. The burn was dressed. Someone brought water. The corridor slowly filled with purpose as the freeze wore off completely, and everyone who had been standing still started compensating by moving very quickly and being very efficient. Velhari deal with shock by becoming intensely practical. Within 20 minutes, the East Wing was being assessed, the reactor failure was being managed, and a full Imperial incident report was being compiled. Everything was moving. I sat against the wall and drank the water, and noticed that my hands were shaking. Not from fear, that had passed. Just the body processing what it had been through and presenting the bill. Saravi came and sat next to me. She did not say anything for a while. She just sat there, and we both looked at the corridor, and it was, I realized, a little like the late nights in her reading room, minus the chess, and plus a significant amount of smoke damage. She asked, eventually, if I had been scared. I said yes. She asked what it had felt like. I thought about it honestly. It had felt like being cold in a very hot place. It had felt like being very aware of my own heartbeat. It had felt like a door in my head going quiet, the part that generates reasons to stop, the part that runs a very fast calculation on personal risk, and on the other side of that quiet, there was just movement, forward, because there was somewhere to be. She was quiet for a moment. She said she did not understand it, not as a criticism, as a statement of genuine puzzlement. Her people could not override what their bodies did in the presence of fire. It was not a choice. It was not a failure. It was simply how they were built. She said she had studied human psychology, that it was part of her preparation for dealing with the diplomatic corps, and she had read about the human tendency toward danger response, toward running into burning buildings and pulling people out of water, and standing between threats and people they cared about. She had read about it in the same way she had read about deep-sea creatures, interesting, strange, very far from anything she would ever personally encounter. She was quiet again. Then she said that when she had seen me through the panel in the door, when she had been standing frozen in the smoke and unable to move, and certain that she was going to die in a room she had read 10,000 books in, and she had looked up and seen a face through the glass, she had thought for one disoriented moment that she was seeing something that did not make sense. A human, running toward her, when every sane response said run away. She said she wanted to know what that was. I thought about it. I said it was probably nothing more complicated than the fact that she was in there, that when you care about someone, the calculation changes. It is not that the fear disappears. The fear is there. You feel every part of it, but it stops being the deciding factor because there is another factor, and that one is heavier. She looked at me for a long time. She said she thought she understood it academically. I said that was probably the best either of us could do. She almost smiled. Saravi almost smiling was an event, something that happened in the corners of her face and was gone before you could be sure you had seen it. And I had catalogued exactly 9 of them over 7 months of chess and cold coffee. This was the 10th. 3 weeks later, at a formal court session I was technically not senior enough to attend, Queen Velithra announced a revision to my diplomatic designation. The announcement was in high formal Velhari, which I could follow at about 70% accuracy, and the remaining 30% was covered by the fact that I could see every Velhari in the room reacting with an expression that suggested something unusual was happening. Afterward, one of the senior court translators, a woman named Adela, who had been at the court for 9 years and had the efficient, amused energy of someone who had seen everything, pulled me aside and told me what the title meant. She said there was a Velhari honorific that had not been used for an outsider in the entire recorded history of the Empire. It had been used for members of the imperial family, for commanders who had carried wounded soldiers off fields when escape meant leaving them, for a few figures in old texts who had stayed when staying was the wrong choice and yet somehow had been the right one. She said the rough translation was, "one who carries another's life." I stood there in the corridor holding my translation tablet and tried to look like a person who received ancient imperial honorifics regularly and was very calm about it. Adela watched me for a moment and then said, with the dry humor of someone who had been at a foreign court long enough to have given up on formality, that I was taking it well. I said I was processing it. She nodded. She went back to her work. I stood in the corridor for another minute, and I thought about Siravi sitting next to me in the smoke-damaged hall, asking what it felt like to run toward a fire. I thought about the queen on her knees, which was an image I was fairly certain I would never fully put down. I thought about a beam clipping my arm, and a door that did not want to open, and a walk through hot air with someone who could not help me carry her. I thought about what Adela had said, one who carries another's life. I suppose that was one way to put it. The other way was simpler, and it was the way I kept coming back to when the formal language got too large. She was in there, so I went. That is all it ever really is. You hear it described as courage, as heroism, as some kind of special quality that certain people have and others do not. But it is not special. It is not rare. It is just the thing that happens when the fear gets quiet enough, and the reason to move gets loud enough, and the distance between where you are and where you need to be becomes the only math that matters. Saravi started studying human decision-making after that, not academically. She started asking questions. She asked the other humans in the diplomatic corps about their own near experiences with danger, about the choices they had made, about what the moment before the choice felt like. She sat with the answers for days at a time. She told me once, about 2 months after the fire, that she thought she was beginning to understand it, not to feel it, that she accepted was not something her biology would allow, but to understand the shape of it, the logic underneath the illogic. The way that love, which is a soft word for what is actually a very hard thing, changes the weight of every calculation it touches. She said it was the most interesting thing she had ever studied. I told her it was the most obvious thing in the world. She said that was exactly what made it so interesting. We played chess that night until very late. She won 2 games. I won 1. The coffee was hot, and the corridor outside was quiet, and the East Wing was already being rebuilt with fire suppression systems that would never fail the same way twice. Outside the palace, the Empire continued. 42 star systems of politics and trade and ancient ceremony, all of it orbiting a queen who had once knelt on a smoke-damaged floor and looked at a human with an expression that had no word in either of our languages. I kept working. I translated, I attended functions, I drank coffee, I had to smuggle in through diplomatic channels and played chess 3 nights a week, and made sure I always knew where the fire exits were, which had always been my habit, but now felt like something more than habit. The title sat in the court records, one who carries another's life. I did not know what to do with it, so I did what I had always done with things that were too big to hold. I put it down, and I kept moving.